This is the story of America's war with Vietnam and how it began. The history of Vietnam is one of conflict and great dynastic struggles, which have led to fragmentation of the country over the centuries, as well as inheriting the influence of many cultures.
The idea that there's been one people called the Vietnamese throughout the last 2,000 years is a bit of a modern invention.
After centuries of war in Vietnam, the one that began in 1955 would be internationally reported news and last for 20 years.
America say that they're fighting an army of peasants, so how could they possibly lose? However, these people culturally know about war much better than any American does.
A war that America deemed necessary in the fight against communism.
These very intelligent men really thought that it was the beginning of the communist takeover of the world.
There was a genuine, basic misinterpretation of what the threat that communism held for the United States and the rest of the free world.
That's one of the really astounding things about the war, that such intelligent men could have been so wrong.
The Tet Offensive, the fact that the Viet Cong had entered the American embassy in Saigon, caused a great deal of damage. It did turn American public opinion totally against the war.
The protests were not even so much the soldiers as their mothers. Because what the hell is my boy doing in Vietnam?
The devastation of this war continues to resonate today. Vietnam is the story of two major river deltas, the Red River Delta in the north and the Mekong Delta in the south.
The three geographic areas of Vietnam were first settled, as far as we know from the archaeology, by three different ethnic groups. The Vietnamese in the north, the Cham people in that central coastal strip who belonged to various kingdoms known as Champa. And then the Mekong Delta was settled earliest by Cambodians. The Cham people came actually from across the sea, probably from the north coast of Borneo, and they were great sailors and seafarers and traders. And they speak a language that's related to Malay. And they developed their own civilization in central Vietnam, largely influenced by Hinduism and to some extent Buddhism as well from India.
They used to be the dominant kingdom, or the dominant political society on the South China Sea. For 5 or 6 centuries, it was the Sham that controlled trade on the South China Sea.
Trade then expanded from Europe to China, seeing the arrival of Western traders, as well as Muslim traders from India and the Middle East. Slowly, Champa became mostly converted to Islam, while Christianity became very important in the central and northern regions.
Full-scale war broke out between the northern and the southern Vietnamese kingdoms. Part of their weaponry came from trading with the Westerners, so that the Dutch would supply weapons to the Trinh in the north, and their ships would cross over the Portuguese ships supplying weapons from Macau near Hong Kong to the Nguyen family in the southern kingdom.
Those are the first European contacts, but they were rapidly followed by the Dutch and then the British and the French. Before the Europeans arrived, and throughout this period, there were flourishing local, quite sophisticated communities and societies, often with cultures that had borrowed elements from religion to the way that kings ruled to political organization from India more than from China.
Vietnam's interaction with Europe brought the arrival of Catholic missionaries, particularly the Portuguese. It was not until the arrival of French missionaries from the mid-17th century that their influence across Vietnam was really felt. The most significant of these missionaries was Alexander de Rhodes. He studied the Vietnamese language and compiled a dictionary into French. This opened up the language to foreign influence. The French converted an increasing number of Vietnamese from Confucianism to Roman Catholicism. The emperor became angry and ordered the execution of many missionaries. This was a turning point from friendly trading relations to aggressive behavior. The French almost seemed to use the execution of their missionaries as a reason to invade. They were without any territories, unlike the British in India, the Portuguese in the Philippines, the Dutch in Indonesia. They decided to take over Vietnam and establish a colony.
There was this constant tension between different regions of Vietnam, and the French arrived in that context and indeed conquered Vietnam piecemeal.
Around 1860, the French seized the area near Saigon. In the next 2 decades, they moved through central and northern Vietnam, with French troops expanding their control over all 6 provinces on the Mekong Delta, and formed a colony known as Ho Chi Minh.
They divided the country into those 3 regions, which it had never been divided into before.
France assumed control over the whole of Vietnam. French Indochina was formed in October 1887. Cambodia and Laos were added in 1893. In the following years, the French influence would play a significant role in shaping Vietnam. Throughout its history, the country had been invaded by a stream of dynasties, and by the late 19th century, Vietnam had become vulnerable to French ambition. Years of civil war had led to a split between the North and the South. It was into this environment that resentment of French occupation gave a space for nationalism and then communism to rise. The influence of Russia and China alarmed the USA.
South Vietnam is already under attack.
But how did events lead to such a catastrophic loss of life? And how necessary was America's involvement in a war so far from home? By 1884, France had taken control over Vietnam, forming the territories of Tonkin, Annam, and Ho Chi Minh. The French were keen to bring Vietnam under French law, and it wasn't long before French culture grew across the country.
The French conquest was in fact supported by some Vietnamese, including Catholics, but also some others who thought that the French could bring modernization to Vietnam. So there were some Vietnamese who sided with the French, and including some who benefited economically. They were distributed lands in the south, particularly in the Mekong Delta. So a new landlord class developed.
As French influence expanded, they soon established the bureaucracy and architecture of their towns, building town halls, law courts, and schools. The education system evolved for the expatriates, but soon became a fashion for the wealthy local residents as well.
In Hue, capital of the Annan section of Indochina, the Japanese, always so polite, do not disturb the semblance of ancient rule, likewise carefully preserved by the French colonial administration. In a modern home built for her by the French at Dalat, the Empress of Annan brings up her 3 attractive children in truly royal atmosphere. She accepts with oriental resignation the obvious facts of the situation.
It was clear to parents that if they wanted their children to rise in the bureaucracy and get positions, they needed to know the newly adopted Latin alphabet, which came to be known as Quoc Ngu, or the national script. And so the Vietnamese culture became internationalized in a way it hadn't been before, and at the same time a new familiarity with Western political ideologies, including communism.
It was into this climate of French education that Ho Chi Minh was brought up, the man who would change Vietnam's history forever. As a young man, he was keen to see the world and took employment on ships as a deckhand. He traveled to America, lived in London for a while, where he was rumored to have spent time as a cook, and also lived in Paris. Whilst in Paris, he petitioned for the independence and civil rights of the Vietnamese people from French rule. When this failed in the US under President Woodrow Wilson, Ho Chi Minh became disillusioned, which furthered his communist zeal. He spent time in Russia and China before being imprisoned by Chiang Kai-shek. His reputation at home was developing, and when he returned in 1941, he had almost a hero status.
He was very much a man of the world. He'd been educated by the French. He'd travelled around the world as a sailor, worked as a chef in London. In the Paris peace talks of 1919, he turned up at Versailles and demanded freedom from French colonialism for the Vietnamese people and was thrown out.
Ho Chi Minh was a member of the French Socialist Party, which split in 1919, and he joined the communist faction which founded the French Communist Party.
During the Second World War, France had fallen to Nazi Germany in June 1940. The Vichy government in Paris immediately ceded control of Saigon and Hanoi to Japan. Japan enforced the right to land forces in Vietnam. They needed to block the transportation of war materials through Vietnam to the Allies. When Ho Chi Minh was released from prison in China, he returned to Vietnam to lead the Viet Minh independence movement. They fought against the Vichy French and Japanese forces.
During World War II, Ho Chi Minh returned to China and with General Giap and others set up a communist resistance who fought the Japanese. In 1945, they'd taken over the north part of Vietnam. The south was liberated by the British, who, to justify taking back their own colonies in the Far East, rearmed the Japanese to hold the country until the French turned up to reoccupy South Vietnam.
The Japanese and the French were very anti-communist, and the Vietnamese Communist Party had been founded in 1930 by Ho Chi Minh. He and the other Vietnamese communists rejected both the Japanese and the French, and they were the only large political party in Vietnam which did oppose both the French and the Japanese. But at the end of the war, when both of those groups lost, the communists led by Ho Chi Minh were in a stronger position to take over.
I remember that many people at that time talk a lot about Ho Chi Minh, who they call Uncle Ho. At that time, everyone thought he was somewhere, like up there, going down to hell. But obviously, he also a human being with some kind of ambition of his own.
People respected Ho Chi Minh as a great patriot and were willing to support him. They were tired of being dominated by the French and now the Japanese and fought for their freedom. He oversaw many successful military actions against the French and then against Japanese occupation of Vietnam during World War II, supported secretly by the United States Office of Strategic Services.
Ho Chi Minh had meanwhile formed an alliance with the United States and was rescuing French and American pilots who were shot down by the Japanese and delivering them to the American forces in the south of China. And so Ho Chi Minh was able to build an army with some support from the United States and was in a position to take over once the Japanese were defeated.
Over the years, Ho Chi Minh had developed a significant army. The country was in the midst of a huge famine. The Vietnam peasants blamed the French and Japanese, who were keeping the rice to feed their troops, even exporting it to Japan. After the Japanese had handed Vietnam to the Viet Minh in 1945, an estimated 2 million Vietnamese people had died.
One of the problems at the end of the Second World War is it led into a variety of other wars, particularly in Indochina. And the Vietnam War, which the United States inherited from the French, which they had lost, was in fact inherited from Ho Chi Minh himself when he had been an ally of the United States. And I think that the basic problem was Ho Chi Minh was a nationalist, first and foremost, not a communist.
Since 1945, the American foreign policy was the containment of communism. There was the famous domino theory that if South Vietnam fell to the communists, so would Laos, Cambodia, Thailand. It would spread down the Malay Peninsula until Eventually, Australia would become communist, and one senator famously said, we don't want to start fighting them when they land on Waikiki Beach.
There's no question in my mind that these very intelligent men, McNamara and Rusk, really thought that it was the beginning of the communist takeover of the world. I mean, that famous domino theory, and they all believed it, and it was dead wrong.
The French finally built up to a point where Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh in the north decided to resist, and they started to attack the French in Hanoi in December of 1946. And the war, which lasted until 1954, began then.
Meanwhile, the situation in French Indochina grows graver as bitter fighting sweeps through Hanoi, leaving misery and destruction in its wake. French troops move up country to engage the well-equipped forces of the Vietnam Republic, who made a desperate but unsuccessful bid to massacre the entire French population of the city.
The French declared Vietnam independent, and that just pushed the country into the communist hand, because everyone wanted to be independent, and only communist was organized, well organized.
The only intention, as far as I can tell, that Ho Chi Minh had about any other country was South Vietnam. President Eisenhower's refusal to help the French with airstrikes at the time of Dien Bien Phu. Ho Chi Minh was so able to marshal his forces, get Soviet aid in, and at the same time keep the Chinese from getting frantic about it and getting help from them as well. And then that was his determination with an extraordinarily brilliant general.
Over to the French fighting communism in Indochina as Ju-52 planes lend their weight in an all-out offensive against the red jungle strongholds of the Viet Minh forces.
Particularly after the fall of China to the Mao's communist regime and the start of the Korean War in 1949 and 1950, respectively, the United States began to give massive military support and political support to the French effort in Indochina from 1950.
The Americans were initially very reluctant to support them, but partly in exchange for support for France and NATO in Europe, the Americans decided to support France in Indochina, which led to American financial support and advisors and that sort of thing.
The fight for Indochina goes on. French pilots flying American planes take up with the big guns left off, blasting communist divisions which had infiltrated French positions in the Hanoi Delta.
For the next 4 years of that war, the United States paid for about 80% of the French military budget. And at the same time, the Chinese were supporting the Vietnamese independence movement led mostly by communists and fought mostly in the north.
Many people from the south, like everyone in Vietnam at that time, joined Viet Minh because their relationship, their involvement with resistance, they have the heart for it.
War comes to peaceful rice paddies, rich prize the Reds were hoping to seize, until the French, aided by the loyal Vietnamese, drove them into the sea. But from the backwaters of war come the helpless victims of aggression, the women, the children, the old and infirm. Communism passed their way. They have little left now but a spark of life that drives them on toward escape and sanctuary behind the French lines.
It's clear that people on all sides were fighting for different reasons. The Americans were fighting to stop this tide of communism that would sweep down from China through Vietnam into the rest of Indochina, the rest of Southeast Asia. The Vietnamese, some of them may have thought they were part of an international movement, but many of them were just fighting for their own personal reasons, to liberate the country against foreign occupiers or to get rid of the power of landlords and that kind of thing. The war that broke out in 1946 dragged on for 8 years and has its culmination at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, where a very bold move by the French military goes completely wrong and they're outfought and outthought by the guerrillas under General Zapp.
The First Indochina War came to an end with the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954, culminating in a comprehensive defeat for the French. France agreed to withdraw its forces from all its colonies, and a conference at Geneva decided on the division of Vietnam, with control of the north given to the Viet Minh as the Democratic Republic of Vietnam under Ho Chi Minh, and the south becoming the state of Vietnam, nominally under Emperor Bao Dai. This prevented Ho Chi Minh from gaining control of the entire country. After the division of Vietnam into North and South, the North is seen as a communist threat by the United States. South Vietnam's Prime Minister Ngo Dinh Diem faced a 2-year deadline for a nationwide reunification vote. However, the US feared that Diem might not win. In the north, the Viet Minh had formed the National Liberation Front under Ho Chi Minh, known as the Viet Cong, and started guerrilla warfare in the south of the country in an attempt to gain control.
President Diem came back to Vietnam with the acceptance from the last emperor Bao Dai. In a referendum, he ousted Bao Dai, sent him into exile in France, and he became president.
The South was still administered from Saigon until there was going to be an election which would then unite the country. When the Americans realized that they wouldn't win any election against the communists, they backed Prime Minister Diem in South Vietnam to set up an independent state so it would be analogous to North and South Korea.
Because of the influence of the Korean War upon American thinking, when the French lost at Dien Bien Phu, and Eisenhower had to decide what to do about the country, he decided to support the South Vietnamese government in place, and they supported that dreadful man Diem. Diem was like a South American dictator about whom some American general, I think, once said, he's a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch. And that strain of thought ran through the American government when they looked at their allies around the world. And it was a mistake.
Half of the villages were under communist rule in 1954, and it wasn't clear who was going to come out on top. And indeed, the United States and the other political groups also expected that the communists would win.
It wasn't anything great American conspiracy to rule the world or anything. They just didn't want the Russians to take over when they realized that Soviet communism, as they saw it, was a menace, which it was. It would influence other parts of the world that they thought they could reach. And as a consequence, Vietnam, after the French were defeated at Dien Bien Phu, was a prime candidate for American help.
And so the Diem regime immediately turned its attention to the religious, or the political religious sects in the Mekong Delta, and attacked them first. And so there was fighting in the streets of Saigon in 1954 and 1955, and much of it spread to the Mekong Delta. There was a sort of civil war in the early days of the South Vietnamese regime.
The divisions and unrest in Vietnam continued. The rioting intensified, and the Vietnamese people continued to see Ho Chi Minh and the National Liberation Front as a way to gain back their independence. America continued to closely monitor the situation, uneasy at the rapid rise of communism in Vietnam, which they deemed to be a direct threat to them. This mood prompted President Kennedy to send in aid, ultimately ending in over 500,000 US troops and a bloody war that would last for 20 years. In the 20th century, Vietnam had endured invasion from France and China. It had seen the creation of Indochina under French rule and the development of French culture and influence in the coming years. After the defeat of the French at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, the Geneva Peace Conference divided the country, with control of the South, now led by Diem, supported by America.
Riders on the storm.
North Vietnam was given to the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, led by Ho Chi Minh. He formed the National Liberation Front, also known as the Viet Cong, and began an uprising against the South.
To this world we're thrown.
The National Liberation Front were gaining significant strength in Vietnam. To many Vietnamese, the Viet Minh were heroes. To America's leaders, Ho Chi Minh represented communism and a significant threat.
For man holds in his mortal hand the power to abolish all forms of human poverty and all forms of human life. And yet the same revolutionary beliefs for which our forebears fought are still at issue around the globe.
The Viet Minh were able to recruit in the south, centre and north. The religious groups in the south were not able to recruit in the centre and north. The Vietnamese Nationalist Party was more northern-based, and Ngo Dinh Diem's following was largely among Vietnamese Catholics, and particularly in his home base of central Vietnam. And so the Viet Minh built the biggest political organisation. The Viet Minh were able to recruit the peasants, whereas most of the other political groups didn't show much interest.
It's a communist party that it's disciplined, there are lots of people, has the ability to take power from the top right down into the villages and mobilise large numbers of people.
By the early 1960s, Hanoi's policy shifted further again towards supporting the guerrilla war that was already developing fast in the south. Meanwhile, the United States had built up its own forces. They had surpassed the Geneva limit on foreign forces in South Vietnam.
The position of this administration has been carefully considered, and we have sought to make it just as clear as we know how to the governments concerned.
President Kennedy pledged aid to Diem. It hadn't been long since America had not been able to defeat the communists in North Korea, and they were intent on not losing to them again in Vietnam. In 1961, 400 American Green Beret special advisors are sent to train soldiers in the fight against the Viet Cong guerrillas under Ho Chi Minh. In October that year, General Maxwell Taylor reports to the president and advises Kennedy to expand the number of US military advisors and to send 8,000 combat soldiers. The number of troops sent by Kennedy will eventually surpass 16,000 by 1963.
It was a serious mistake for Kennedy to get involved, as he did, with American force in that part of the world, thinking that this great monolithic Soviet-style communism would rule the roost, when he could have played it differently, I believe, and fought it more subtly.
The great word of the Vietnam War gave us was escalation, because it starts off with Kennedy sending in just 400 military advisors who are actually special forces, organising and controlling the action, and then more go in, and then more go in.
He should have fought it with the limited aid he gave initially, with the development of the special forces, the Green Berets as they're called, and other small tactical units, and not created this great surge of North Vietnamese resentment.
South Vietnam is already under attack, sometimes by a single assassin, sometimes by a band of guerrillas, recently by full battalions. The peaceful borders of Burma, Cambodia, and India have been repeatedly violated, and the peaceful people of Laos are in danger of losing the independence they gained not so long ago.
The eventual result was that the United States decided that the South would lose very quickly if it didn't change policy, and that the United States needed to move in with regular forces on a large scale.
The Chinese, whether communists or nationalists, were age-old enemies of the Vietnamese. It was the threat of Soviet communism and the fact that China had fallen with Mao in a way that was assisted by the Soviets was, to the Americans, they had created this monster in their imaginations and they had to go and fight it.
There's something happening here, but what it is ain't exactly clear.
In the final analysis, it's their war. They're the ones who have to win it or lose it. We can help them, we can give them equipment, we can send our men out there as advisors, but they have to win it, the people of Vietnam, against the communists. So all we can do is help, and we're making it very clear. But I don't agree with those who say we should withdraw. That'd be a great mistake.
Hey, what's that sound? Everybody look what's going down.
President Kennedy was conflicted about Vietnam. He realized that he couldn't give up the territory, but faced a crisis by July. Despite increased US support, the South Vietnamese military was not making any ground against the Viet Cong forces.
The regime of South Vietnam's President Ngo Dinh Diem comes to an end in a wave of violence. A few days before the army revolt, these last pictures showed a man who seemed to have no premonition of the horrible death he was to meet.
The situation in Saigon was intensifying as the Viet Cong fought against Diem, ultimately leading to his death.
Water fire concentrates on tanks and armored carriers blocking the way to the palace. For 2.5 hours, the palace comes under heavy bombardment before the white flag is raised. Meanwhile, Diem and his brother, Ngo Dinh Nhu, had fled the palace in disguise. They were later captured, only to die in an armored car that was taking them to prison.
3 weeks later in the US, the nation was to be shocked by the tragic assassination of President Kennedy on November 22nd, 1963.
At 1:25, the motorcade moves into the downtown area. Death is 6 minutes away. In a warehouse, a sniper with a rifle poised waits. The cheers of the crowd almost muffle the 3 shots. The assassin's aim is deadly.
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago. Vice President Lyndon Johnson has left the hospital in Dallas, but we do not know to where he has proceeded. Presumably, he will be taking the oath of office shortly and become the 36th President of the United States.
Lyndon Johnson was thrust into the presidency after the assassination. The country was in disarray. The worsening situation in Vietnam had been Kennedy's most pressing problem, and Johnson inherited America's commitment to Vietnam and to defeating communism.
President Johnson, for all his great virtues, wasn't very strong on foreign policy. He had been in the Navy during the Pacific War, and he believed, one, that overwhelming force worked militarily, and number 2, he was a great Texan wheeler dealer. He figured if he waved the big stick, he could negotiate with Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh didn't want to negotiate with anyone. He knew eventually he would win. They could control how many people they were losing, and all they were doing was keeping their casualties down to below their birth rate.
In August 1964, an incident off the Gulf of Tonkin triggered a reaction from President Johnson.
The determination of all Americans to carry out our full commitment to the people and to the government of South Vietnam will be redoubled by this outrage.
Ultimately, this reaction would lead to the beginning of a war in Vietnam, a war that still resonates. The justification remains a question to this day. Lyndon Johnson became the 36th President of the United States after the assassination of John F. Kennedy in November 1963. He inherited an economic crisis in America that saw him proclaim a war on poverty. He had inherited another conflict, a war on communism and America's commitment to Vietnam. The increased strength of the Viet Cong and the rise of communism demanded more resources from Johnson. But until now, he had resisted the need to escalate the situation. However, in August 1964, President Johnson decided to act after events at the Gulf of Tonkin.
Destroyers of the United States Navy are assigned routine patrols from time to time. Sunday, August the 2nd, 1964, the destroyer Maddox was on such a patrol. Shortly after noon, the calm of the day is broken as general quarters sound.
When the Gulf of Tonkin, inverted commas, incident comes along, and there's a spurious report that American warships have been attacked by Vietnamese patrol boats, they use as an excuse.
The Gulf of Tonkin incident illustrates this capability for instant retaliation against unprovoked attack.
The USS Maddox's captain sent a report that 3 North Vietnamese torpedo boats supposedly fired on them. but then sent a retraction that it had been foul weather and not an attack. However, President Johnson ignored the retraction and ordered the bombing of torpedo boat bases and an oil depot.
President Lyndon Johnson obtained an almost unanimous approval from the US Congress to escalate the war in Vietnam, and bombing aircraft was sent north.
He knew everyone on Capitol Hill. He could get anything through that he wanted. They gave him this Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which he said it was like grandmother's nightshirt. It covered everything. And it just gave him carte blanche to fight how he wished.
It is my duty to the American people to report that renewed hostile actions against United States ships on the high seas in the Gulf of Tonkin have today required me to order the military forces of the United States to take action in reply.
Eastern world, it is exploding, violence flaring, bullets loading. You're old enough to kill, but not for voting. You don't believe in war, but what's that gun you're toting? And even the Jordan River has bodies floating, but you tell me over and over and over again, my friend, you don't believe we're on the eve of destruction.
But repeated acts of violence against the armed forces of the United States must be met not only with alert defense, but with positive reply. That reply is being given as I speak to you tonight.
My friend, you don't believe we're on the eve of destruction.
Full-scale military action on Vietnam had begun. The Viet Cong retaliate with a bombing onslaught on a US airbase.
One of the major impacts of the United States buildup of ground troops in South Vietnam was that the communist guerrillas in the South started recruiting at an increased level themselves. And in fact, from 1964 to 1965, the communist guerrillas quadrupled their recruitment. Meanwhile, the United States was building up its forces at an even faster rate to hundreds of thousands.
The American commitment on the ground in South Vietnam rises from 12,000 to 200,000. And suddenly, everyone in America is affected.
Despite a campaign for de-escalation of US involvement, Johnson's attack on Vietnam is greeted with much support in the USA, and his popularity rises. He wins a landslide victory to be US president. Within a year, he had given the command for Operation Rolling Thunder to begin.
And it's been the ruin of many a poor boy. In God, I know I won.
Forces on both sides built up with the contribution made from North Vietnam of regular troops coming into the fighting as well. And the destruction that was being conducted and carried out in the villages of South Vietnam, particularly the populated areas where the impact was greatest, but also in the forested areas. The level of destruction escalated enormously from the mid-60s onwards and had an enormous impact on the Vietnamese people's livelihood, on the way people tried to survive in the cities, fleeing from the countryside where the war was strongest into the cities. The cities began to fill up with rural refugees. Protest movements developed in the cities.
The continuous arrival of US troops and a large buildup of the South Vietnamese army meant that America could inflict large casualties, not just on the northern Vietnamese regulars who had moved south, but also on the guerrillas and the South Vietnamese communist regular troops as well. Large-scale rioting in Saigon continues.
We have made a national pledge to help South Vietnam defend its independence. And I intend to keep that promise.
America could not politically invade the North because they hadn't declared war. This was a police action, so that they couldn't invade the North, but they did feel that they were able to bomb it. This was called Operation Rolling Thunder, and they just tried to pulverize all the industry, all the supply lines, everything in the North. And in a month, they would drop as much ordnance from North Vietnam as had been dropped in the whole of World War II.
This bombardment of air raids would last 3 years, together with the deployment of Agent Orange. This was just the start of a war that would rage for many years. A war that would affect Vietnam and America for decades to come. The fear of encroaching communism drew America into the conflict of the Vietnam War.
Fear scares the hell out of everybody. And who pays for it?
People were so gung-ho about attacking the North Vietnamese that they made some serious mistakes.
At first, the 400 special forces were just sent as advisors to the Vietnamese, but these numbers were soon to escalate.
The word advisors needs to be taken with a grain of salt. Pilots were flying missions, helicopters, and large amounts of military equipment were being supplied by the United States.
We did the only anti-war coverage in America going on then. You couldn't come out against the war. Kids were beaten up by cops in every town and city in America for coming out against the war.
Public opinion, which had supported the war at first, turned when endless battles were shown nightly on television, without any sign of success.
Because of the exposure, the American public became suddenly aware of how self-destructive this war was.
I was aghast at the number of people who really had no concept at all of what the war was about in a fighting sense.
The age of Aquarius brings civil dissent, peace marches, the death of a president, and a North Vietnamese leader who is playing a patient game.
When you put young men in harm's way, they do bad things.
Were there any Americans who thought the Americans were going to win the war? So what are you doing in the jungle?
From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time. Vice President Lyndon Johnson has left the hospital in Dallas, but we do not know to where he has proceeded. Presumably, he will be taking the oath of office shortly and become the 36th President of the United States.
Lyndon Johnson has made his way to the presidential plane. There, he takes the oath of office, ensuring that presidential power is unbroken. The first milestone of his presidency was the signing of the new Civil Rights Act of 1964 into law. The Gulf of Tonkin incident is used by Johnson to launch into the war. He has kept things low-key till now in order to be re-elected. As an ex-Navy man, he is keen to take up the challenge to finish the war and retaliates with air attacks.
The determination of all Americans to carry out our full commitment to the people and to the government of South Vietnam will be redoubled by this outrage.
America has misinterpreted Ho Chi Minh's intentions, and instead of supporting him earlier against the French, they opposed him. Ho Chi Minh was a nationalist, but with no other support, he had to turn to the Russians, into the arms of the communists.
He wasn't a screaming nationalist fanatic. Didn't come across as a fanatic at all.
He wasn't a communist, he was a nationalist. I mean, he was a great hero to his country, you know.
I mean, they called him Uncle Ho, and he looked like your uncle, and he was smiling, and he looked like a lovely guy.
The vast Mekong River can provide food and water and power on a scale to dwarf even our own TVA.
Johnson was in the mindset that if he went in with force, Ho Chi Minh would capitulate. Johnson offers Ho Chi Minh a vast development program for Vietnam if they pull back.
And we remain ready with this purpose for unconditional discussions.
Ho Chi Minh calculates that he and General Giap will eventually rid Vietnam of this American influence in the South.
President Johnson, for all his great virtues, wasn't very strong on foreign policy. He believed that overwhelming force worked. He was a great Texan wheeler dealer. He figured that if he waved the big stick, he could negotiate with Ho Chi Minh. Ho Chi Minh didn't want to negotiate with anyone.
In my view, on reflection, of course, is that we may have picked the wrong side when it came to Ho Chi Minh in particular and General Giap. We were stuck with it, and then all these murderous bombing runs began.
Johnson retaliates with Operation Rolling Thunder.
The Americans, not being able politically to invade North Vietnam, tried to bomb it into a car park.
President Johnson is advised that the US airfield at Da Nang is vulnerable to attack from the North Vietnamese, and the South Vietnamese army lacks the strength to defend it.
I have asked the commanding general, General Westmoreland, what more he needs to meet this mounting aggression.
General Westmoreland requests a few battalions to protect the airfield. This is the first of many requests for further troops, and by the end of the year, numbers of US troops would rise to 200,000.
They escalated and escalated. The LBJ escalated it, and then everybody was escalating it, you know.
Suddenly, everyone in America is affected.
The bombing campaign and increasing troops does little to stop the North Vietnamese army moving personnel and supplies through Laos and into South Vietnam. American B-52 planes are sent in to bomb North Vietnam for the first time. These continuous, devastating air raids would last for 3 years and include the heavy deployment of Agent Orange.
Agent Orange was actually used on American highways to keep the weeds down off the side of the expressways. But it was used in massive amounts in Vietnam, and there's dioxin, which causes the cancer and birth defects.
As more and more US troops are sent to Vietnam, the stark reality of the war hits home in America.
Anti-war demonstrators protest U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War.
Public support for the war begins to slide as anti-war demonstrations increase in the U.S.
The estimated 125,000 Manhattan marchers include students, housewives, beatnik poets, doctors, businessmen, teachers, priests, and nuns. Makeup and costumes were bizarre.
In a major war effort, the ground offensive, Operation Cedar Falls, begins. 30,000 US and South Vietnamese troops are sent to destroy Viet Cong operations and supply sites near Saigon. Protest rallies and marches against the war in Vietnam continued to increase. Veterans from World War I, World War II, and Korea stage a protest in New York City. Muhammad Ali was world champion from 1964 until 1967, when he was stripped of his titles. He caused a sensation when he refused to be inducted into the army.
You my enemies. My enemies are white people, not Viet Congs or Chinese or Japanese.
That's all. Just no comment on boxing, religion, induction, no comments on the weapon or nothing.
He refused to step forward. He was sentenced to 5 years in jail. They stripped his title. While he was waiting for the Supreme Court to decide his case, he spent his time going to colleges, talked all over the country. He gave young people the guts to come out against the war.
Other artist activists such as Joan Baez, Pete Seeger, and Bob Dylan had joined what was to become an international movement against the Vietnam War. In April 1967, Martin Luther King Jr. makes a powerful speech. Previously, he had not been vocal about Vietnam in order not to upset President Johnson, as the civil rights legislation was going through during his presidency. He speaks out against US policy in Vietnam, calling America the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. He publicly denounces their military presence in Vietnam and proposes a merger of the anti-war and civil rights movement.
The promises of the Great Society have been shot down on the battlefield of Vietnam. The pursuit of this widened war has narrowed the promised dimensions of the domestic welfare programs, making the poor, white and Negro, bear the heaviest burdens both at the front and at home.
Hey Joe, where you going with that gun in your hand?
In June 1967, the first Monterey Pop Festival takes place, showcasing many artists who've been expressing their anti-Vietnam feelings. When Jimi Hendrix takes to the stage, many young men in the audience already have their draft papers.
You know, I'm gonna mess around with another man.
You had Ravi Shankar on one side, and then you had The Who smashing up guitars on the other, and Jimi Hendrix somewhere in the middle. And that would certainly have been a kind of rallying cry for, increasing anti-Vietnam sentiment.
There have been various incidents of burning draft cards, but this was brought into intense focus when it was acted out in the musical Hair in New York in October 1967.
People in colleges were pretty well organized by this time because they'd been fighting for civil rights. So they knew how to protest. And this essentially divides the country, that the younger generation know how to cause trouble, know how to, if necessary, avoid the draft and flee to Canada. Whereas the older people remember World War II and remember being right.
1967. The summer of love had a bloody underbelly. Young American boys are sent to fight their counterparts in Vietnam. This will be brought to a terrifying conflagration with the shock of the Tet Offensive. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara visits General Westmoreland to assess the situation on the ground. Their advice to President Johnson is taken up, and troop numbers are eventually increased to more than 500,000. As more and more US troops enter Vietnam, the siege of Khe Sanh begins, and the Marines are cut off.
The United States had begun to suspect that the North Vietnamese strategy was to lure the Americans into a remote outpost. The Americans thought that they could win that if they built up enough forces and win a conventional battle against the North Vietnamese. And so they built up the large base of Khe Sanh. They expected that the attack would come there. And indeed, it built up all through December and January.
However, this was a distraction from the main event. On the night of January 30th, the Vietnamese New Year, some 80,000 Viet Cong attacked 36 capitals, 64 towns, and 4 American bases. Around 4,000 Viet Cong attacked Saigon, occupied the grounds of the US Embassy, and hit General Westmoreland's headquarters. This was known as the Tet Offensive. Americans have to engage intense force to recover from the sudden onslaught.
The Americans think they're in control of the country. Then comes the Tet Offensive. Tet is the Vietnamese Lunar New Year. The Americans say that there's no chance that the Viet Cong are going to attack them during Tet. It would be like starting an offensive on Christmas Day. It wouldn't happen. However, again, nobody read the Vietnamese history books. The Vietnamese won one of their greatest victories against the Chinese, attacking on Tet.
The Tet Offensive was essentially led by the southern Vietnamese communists, the Viet Cong, backed by the North Vietnamese. But it was a Viet Cong-inspired uprising.
Dozens and dozens of cities came under near-simultaneous attack by mostly NLF southern guerrillas who had been moved into position largely unknown to the US forces.
Suddenly, every town and city in South Vietnam, there are explosions going off. There's gunfire. The Viet Cong even send a suicide squad into the American embassy, and they hold it for hours. This is on American television. The Americans see their own embassy occupied by the enemy.
The fact that the Viet Cong had entered the American embassy in Saigon and caused a great deal of damage shattered public opinion and American faith in winning the war, if the war was ever winnable.
And they can't believe what they're saying. They're being told that they're winning this war, and it doesn't seem that they are.
The battle for Hue was the response to Tet, to endeavor to take back the territory that had been lost to the Viet Cong. It's regarded as one of the bloodiest and longest battles of the Vietnam War, ending in March 1968.
Fighting is violent, and if ever a Marine had to rely on his own quickness and toughness, this was it. House to house, street to street, for 3 long weeks.
Massive retaliation was taken, and the Viet Cong was swept out of the cities and largely annihilated. And this, again, was part of Ho Chi Minh's strategy, because he realized that eventually he was going to win the war, and he didn't want these annoying Southerners, many of whom weren't, the Viet Cong weren't necessarily communists, they were just nationalists. He wanted to get rid of them, and this was a wonderful way to do it.
This meant that the North Vietnamese forces, which had not even appeared in many parts of the South, for instance the Mekong Delta by that time, now began to play a much bigger role in the war, and it became necessary for the Communist forces to have North Vietnamese reinforcements to keep up their level of activity.
After the first day, Marines own just 2 blocks of the city. 2 blocks. And the price is dear.
Militarily, it was a defeat for them, but in political and public relations terms, it was a huge success and badly damaged American morale, particularly at home. And the tide of the war changed.
On the north side of the river, the enemy's position begins to crumble. Marines, along with the South Vietnamese Army, Marine and Ranger units, move into the Imperial Palace.
This great strategist was Ho Chi Minh, because he realized, fighting the Americans, it wasn't about what actually happened in Vietnam, it was what happened on the television sets in the United States. So if he could get the war on the news every night, he knew that America would tire of it sooner or later, and he'd get his way.
Finally, the job is finished. 25 days of heavy fighting. Enemy losses in the thousands. And each Marine knows he's been a part of a historic battle. Knows he rates the traditional, well done.
Although America did win back their territory, this was a huge turning point in the war, as America loses its appearance of invincibility.
Vietnam was the first television war. It was on the nightly news in America, and it was on the news here in the UK, and so had a phenomenal impact.
It was in American living rooms every evening.
It's getting near dawn.
Now CIA men and
MPs have gone into the embassy and are trying to get the snipers out.
This is the main Vietnamese language radio station in Saigon. And right down
And it went on and on and on. And of course, the people in America knew that their sons were going, and there were shots of the body bags coming home. And it's terribly demoralizing. America has this great sort of culture of winning, and they believe that with their wealth, their technical expertise, and their manpower, that they could do anything.
The smoke turned on us again, and out of it, in the briefest lull in the crossfire, soldiers came running out carrying children.
Every time you went around a corner, you see a palm leaf move, and you think, Christ, it's an ambush. Every time you see a junk, you think, it's full of explosives. I mean, this is how American television had weaned me into Vietnam. So I went out there convinced I was either going to be killed or I was going to fail in the story. My very first story in Vietnam, Apocalypse Now, the scene where they're on that little boat, big machine gun up there. Well, that was my first story. River Marine Patrol, it was called. And I was absolutely terrified. I mean, really quite terrified.
Patrols like these in the Mekong Delta are convinced that they're winning their war against the VC. They put as success there, as evidence of their success, the number of VC dead and the number of VC defectors. But they have, nevertheless, the substantial backing of thousands of well-armed and well-trained troops, plus barrack ships, helicopters and gunships, and the River Marine Force.
The problem about TV is that when there were big things happening in Vietnam, your bosses wanted daily news.
Television journalists would go to a battlefield, but they would have to leave the battlefield by a certain time to get back to Saigon Airport and ship their film to Hong Kong.
There were no satellites, of course. We were shooting film. Usually, if you're doing a feature story, we just get to New York, then they would develop it and edit it with your narration. Now, it's sort of hard, I think, for journalists, TV journalists today, to relate to the fact that we were writing our narrations without ever having seen the film that we were narrating. You just watched what you were covering. You watched what your cameraman was filming. You wrote to what you thought he had filmed. And then you laid down the narration, and off it went.
The fire spreads, the people leave, and in no time at all, that area is charred and ruined and destroyed.
You couldn't go too far. So my area of operations tended to be down in the Mekong, which, as it turns out, was a pretty dangerous place to be anyway.
For one moment, they panicked, and rightly so. The mortar hit right in the middle of them down there on the right.
After 6 in the evening, there was nothing to do. That's when we all got into trouble. And now, I mean, there was nothing like 24 hours news. And I remember when the satellite first came up, it was Charles Collingwood who said to me, "Oh, glory days are over. We're going to have to work for a living now."
The journalists working out of Saigon all seem to have a huge affection for the city. It is their retreat from the war, a short helicopter ride away. Nothing could be more of a contrast to the war than their cocktail hour back at the hotels.
We stayed at a hotel in Lam Song Square, which is bang next to the Congress building. The safest part of town. That little center seemed to be protected. Saigon was a fantastic place to be.
They had a very exciting atmosphere. It didn't seem to be in great danger at that time. There were French restaurants, there was an old French residual community there who were very attached to Vietnam, who had Vietnamese wives, a lot of them.
It was French. You know, the wide streets, the plazas, the squares, the trees, the flowers, and the restaurants. You could go to war in the most horrific circumstances and see some rather dreadful things. And then you'd come back and go out into Saigon, cross the road and have the most superb French meal with quite excellent French wine.
The American public has no escape from the war. General Westmoreland's request for more troops had required students to be drafted. This results in an increase in demonstrations as the public feel helpless against this distant struggle. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was developed from earlier footpaths used for trading. It started just south of Hanoi, and due to the mountain range Trong Son, the trail dropped into Laos and Cambodia, and then into South Vietnam west of Dalat. At first, it took several months to reach the south. However, the volume of traffic expanded gradually, from carrying loads on soldiers' backs or in carts, to improvements being made to accommodate heavy trucks. Dotted along the routes were fuel storage tanks and field hospitals. The trail was covered by the heavy jungle canopy and therefore hidden from US bombing raids until the bombing became so intense, destroying the jungle and using Agent Orange to defoliate. Even so, the determination of the North Vietnamese would just make another path around to join the trail again. This trail was supplying several 100,000 troops in the south against the US.
My unit was trying to achieve a workable interdiction of the Ho Chi Minh Trail where it came into South Vietnam, north of Saigon. They bombed the Ho Chi Minh Trail with a supply trail that ran down through Laos and latterly through Cambodia. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was in fact a series of trails, some of them big enough to take vehicles down, but they carried the stuff. It was weapons, food, medicine, that sort of thing, for the fighters in the south, who were either North Vietnamese or Viet Cong. So the bulk of the people we fought in firefights were either North Vietnamese coming down the trail or Viet Cong.
The great story of the war, the best story of the war, was never told. Because the best story of the war was the Ho Chi Minh Trail. How the guys got from North Vietnam, from Hanoi to a large extent, into South Vietnam, and when they got to South Vietnam, managed to fight, is superhuman.
A year of my life was spent either ambushing people or trying to avoid being ambushed by them. That was it. It was ambush warfare, and that's what the nature of the firefights were.
The fantasy, the journalistic fantasy, was to go down the trail with the North Vietnamese. But it never happened.
For years now, the Viet Cong have been strong in the Delta. It's where they've always raised taxes, food, and recruits. And recently, they've even been enrolling boys of 14 and 15. But the Americans say that since the Tet Offensive, Viet Cong tactics have become much more aggressive.
Pressure came down from the top levels to inflate the body count, and sometimes this was done with false reporting of the number of communists killed in particular actions, but also including civilian casualties in the body count.
The Americans thought they'd succeeded in keeping at least the main waterways of the Delta clear of Viet Cong. But now they find that they're not safe even there.
The person who first realized Ho Chi Minh's strategy was Robert McNamara, that the communists were controlling the action in the battlefield. They could attack and run away at will. So they could control how many people they were losing, what their casualties were. And all they were doing was keeping their casualties down to below their birth rate, which meant essentially they could fight forever. And of course, the Americans weren't going to fight forever. Eventually, they'd go home.
The NLF also were able to keep recruiting amongst people who were disillusioned or disgusted by the destruction and the casualties inflicted on the Vietnamese rural population.
It was the kind of place where you had, brothers fighting for the ARVN, the South Vietnamese army run by the South Vietnamese American puppets, and then you had his brother in the Viet Cong. And the Americans could never understand what was going on. They didn't understand the language, they didn't understand the culture. They didn't understand how that was possible. I mean, there weren't any. Can you imagine in the Second World War, you have a GI and his brother is with the Nazis? Unimaginable. But this is what was going on through the whole war.
President Johnson continues this huge US bombing campaign of Rolling Thunder, targeting the Ho Chi Minh Trail in the main. The tonnage of ordnance would surpass all that was dropped in World War II.
In this dirty old part of the city.
Make no mistake about it. I don't want a man in here to go back home thinking otherwise. We are going to win.
You'll be dead before your time is due.
There's another aspect to the war in Vietnam, which is race. This was the first time there was a major commitment of mixed race units. A lot of young black Americans wanted to prove their status in American society, their manhood, if you will. He wanted to get young black men into the army so he could supply proper medical assistance to them, give them education, and get them out of the ghettos and improve their lot. As the war started to go badly, the black guys said, well, hold on, why are we dying over here when the enemy's back home in America?
In the early years of the war, the black and Latino soldiers were professionals in mostly mixed-race units. By the end of 1968, draftees account for over 30% of American troops. Amongst these are many black soldiers who are growing more and more disaffected in what they called a white man's war, when there were so many racial issues to deal with back home. As the casualty rate increased, conscription was now to include college students who had previously been exempt. This meant that although the majority of US soldiers were still volunteers, their numbers now included middle-class white Americans who were forced to defer their university education.
We gotta get out of this place. If it's the last thing we ever do.
When I first went out there in '68, the majority of the infantrymen were all working-class Americans. But when the Americans abandoned this avoidance of the draft, and suddenly in Vietnam, we saw the arrival, not of the officer class, but of white middle-class kids in the ranks.
These are young men who have to go and fight, and the draft comes in, and so you may have to fight against your will. And then the whole idea of the draft dodger comes in.
Well, it wasn't the fact so much that they were university students, it was the middle class. The middle class was getting drafted. Not a chance. Forget it, which is why there hasn't been a draft since then. World War II draft was, everybody believed in the war.
You suddenly had middle-class kids being drafted in to do the same job. And they were writing letters home. Their parents were appealing to their congressmen. And that's when it all started to change.
What just happened? Turn it.
Giant protests were not even so much the soldiers as their mothers. Because what the hell is my boy doing in Vietnam? Yeah, he should be doing his graduate work now. Well, you could get a student deferment for a while, but the middle class was getting drafted, which you can make a coherent theory, saying that that's why we lost the war.
They're only going there for a year tour, whereas the Vietnamese fighters are there all the time. So every time you send a fresh young guy who's just come out of college, they have to start again with a new guy who knows nothing.
All the challenges have been met. The enemy is not beaten, but he knows that he has met his master in the field.
President Johnson was under tremendous pressure over the lack of victory in Vietnam. The Battle of Hue had been the response to the Tet Offensive, as US forces managed to regain the territories that had been lost. But all their claims of victory were like dust in the hand, because this amounted to only a stalemate. In addition, at home, despite all his efforts to pass a Civil Rights Act through Congress to become law, the lack of improvement for the black situation caused the Black Power movement to be active against him. The Democratic Party split into many factions. Johnson does badly in the New Hampshire primary and ends his bid for re-election. The nation is stunned.
With American sons in the field far away, with America's future under challenge right here at home, with our hopes and the world's hopes for peace and the balance every day, I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office, the presidency of your country. Accordingly, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
The famous CBS anchor, Walter Cronkite, he hadn't been in Vietnam since 1965. He went back, saw what he had to see, and said on American television, "We're not winning. Can't win." And at this point, President Johnson said, "If I've lost Walter, I've lost the American public," and he resigns.
A strike in Memphis causes Martin Luther King Jr. to return to his hometown. After his march had been interrupted with civil unrest, he gave his "I came to the mountaintop" speech.
And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
At his motel the next day, preparing to leave for another meeting, Martin Luther King Jr. is shot in the head and dies. That April sees the beginning of riots in many US cities.
Let me tell you what those 4 years have done to America. The longest war that America's ever had in its history. The worst crime wave we've ever had in our history. The highest taxes we've ever had in our history. The highest rate in the cost of living that we've had in a generation. And the lowest respect for the United States of America in our history.
As the squabbling for the presidential election continues, violent conflict breaks out, particularly in Newark and Detroit. In Chicago, a huge anti-war protest outside the Democratic National Convention leads to ugly clashes with police. Hubert Humphrey gains the Democratic nomination, but loses to Nixon by a majority vote of less than 1%.
Along comes President Nixon, who promises peace with honor. To get the boys out of there, everything's going to be all right.
I decided in my mind, I was in Vietnam at the time, that I would vote for Nixon because he, rather than Hubert Humphrey, would end the war. And he would find some way to extricate the United States out of that mess.
Unfortunately, that's not what he gave America. He pulled some of the people out, but he expanded the war into Cambodia and Laos.
However, less than 2 months into office, President Nixon orders the secret bombing of Cambodia, ostensibly to destroy the Ho Chi Minh Trail and the supply enclaves just over the border. This covert bombing of over 500,000 tons of ordnance would actually stretch across the whole of Cambodia and was carried out without the knowledge of Congress or the US public.
We will aid Cambodia. Cambodia is the Nixon doctrine in its purest form. In Cambodia, what we are doing is helping the Cambodians to help themselves.
As part of Nixon's strategy of reducing soldiers on the ground and attacking the Vietnamese communists while trying to negotiate peace in Paris, he launched an illegal bombing against the Viet Cong camps in Cambodia. And he even followed up that with an illegal invasion.
Richard Nixon gave the order for the strategic bombing of Cambodia using US B-52 high-altitude bombing aircraft. And the escalation of the bombing of Cambodia occurred from March 1969.
The war had then spilt over from South Vietnam. We learnt later there had been secret American bombing going on. The South Vietnamese forces and Americans moved into Cambodia to try and wipe out the Vietnamese communist sanctuary areas in the eastern part of Cambodia, which bordered on South Vietnam.
Ho Chi Minh dies. General Giap carries on the strategy of the war. The age of Aquarius ends with students being shot down by the Ohio National Guard. South Vietnam has lost its US support and fights a desperate war alone against the North. Nixon's secret war crimes are brought to light in the Pentagon Papers, in the Washington Post, with the New York Times. General Giap still stands strong for the North as the war in Vietnam rages on. The Vietnam War had already lasted for 13 years. May 1968 saw the beginning of the Paris peace talks. The intention was to stop the fighting between North and South Vietnam, establish peace, and remove the enormous American military presence. America had supported the South Vietnamese since 1955. Presidents John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson had escalated America's involvement in the war, resulting in more than 500,000 troops in Vietnam. In January 1969, Richard Nixon became president and faced extreme hostility to a war that had raged for so long. He assured the American public that he would withdraw the number of US troops considerably. However, he initiated a secret plan and within 2 months was bombing Cambodia. On September 2nd, 1969, President Ho Chi Minh, hero of the revolution, dies. He had been the father figure of the National Liberation Front and had played an amazing game of bringing support from the Soviet Union whilst keeping China at bay in his quest to rid Vietnam of the French and then the Americans.
In 1969, Ho Chi Minh died, but the policy of Hanoi stayed the same. They were happy to sit around a table in Paris, but would essentially agree nothing.
When the truth is found.
Nixon had campaigned under his banner of peace with honor, which was the plan to build up the South Vietnamese forces so that they could defend the South against the communist North or Vietnamization. US troops would be gradually removed.
The American line for the last few years of the war was building up. Vietnamization, they called it. Vietnamization meant creating a South Vietnamese army which was going to salvage South Vietnam from the North Vietnamese evil communists.
Nixon comes to office. He's pulling Americans out, and they're training up the South Vietnamese to fight their own battle. But a lot of these guys, they consider the Americans the really enemy as much as the communist Vietnamese do, and they don't want to die fighting their brothers. So they're a pretty incompetent lot, the South Vietnamese army.
I thought the South Vietnamese had behaved disgracefully during the war and then were treated disgracefully by the United States during the peace treaty. I think the South Vietnamese were exceptionally badly led from the time of Diem onwards.
News broke out in November 1969 that there had been a massacre at the village of My Lai, where more than 400 villagers had been slaughtered by Lieutenant Calley and his troops.
This village was not a stronghold of guerrillas. It was just an ordinary village. There was a village nearby that was a stronghold of the Viet Cong, but Lieutenant Calley, who was in charge of the platoon, couldn't read a map. They went into this village, essentially shot everybody. They raped a lot of the young women and then killed them. They threw one old man down a well and dropped a grenade in after him. Eventually, the survivors were herded up into a drainage ditch, and everyone just emptied their gun into the pile of bodies there.
When you put young men in harm's way, they lose control. They shoot anything that moves, you know. And then you run into guys like Lieutenant Calley, who were psychopaths. I'd venture to say there were 50 My Lais that we never heard about.
Calley was sentenced to life. He served, I think, 18 months under house arrest before being discharged.
You know, the Americans can't be doing this. Land of the free and trying to free the South Viet. They can't be killing the people they're coming here to defend. But I have to say that after a few years of being out there back and forth, it was pretty commonplace. One of the most astonishing things that I can remember, we met a colonel, a very well-educated American. He spoke ancient Greek. He'd got a business degree from Harvard. Everywhere he went, he took his Thai chef. And he took French wine everywhere he went. It was just like a movie. I mean, so much of Vietnam is like a movie. We interviewed him. Then he said, well, gentlemen, thank you very much. I'm now off to kill Kong. I said, you're going on a mission, sir? He said, no. Every afternoon when there's nothing happening, I get in my Bell helicopter and I take my hunting rifle with me and I go and search for Kong. And if I see somebody in the fields, I give him a little bit of a run and then I kill him.
There you go, Sarge.
And I said, you identify them? He said, no. I just kill him. So we said goodbye, and on the way back to Saigon, I said to the PIO, the press information man, a young kid, I said, he was pulling my plonker, wasn't he? I mean, he was pulling my leg. He goes out and shoots Kong in the afternoon? Oh, yes, sir, he says. He just takes his hunting rifle and... I said, but the man's mad. He said, oh, no, sir, not mad. But, you know, when you live down there, you've got to do something like that in your spare time. Otherwise, a man could go crazy.
Thousands of demonstrators opposed to the Vietnam War assembled in the nation's capital for a mass protest.
The Paris peace talks are not moving forward with any sense of resolution. The American public are disgusted at the cover-up of the My Lai massacre.
Military police contain the crowd, but clashes soon break out.
Huge anti-war demonstrations converge on Washington and outside American embassies in European cities. The intense secret bombing of Cambodia continues. President Nixon will soon be under even more pressure to end the war.
A small group of Vietnamese seeking a confrontation marched at night on the South Vietnamese embassy. Washington police used tear gas to drive them away. Arrests were made.
President, some Americans believe this country is heading for revolution, and others believe that Crime and dissent and violent demonstrations are leading us to an era of repression.
This country is not headed for revolution. The very fact that we do have the safety valves of the right to dissent, the very fact that the President of the United States asked the district commissioners to waive their rule for 30 days' notice for a demonstration, that fact is an indication that when you have that kind of safety valve, you're not going to have revolution, which comes from repression.
As the hostilities in America continue, soldiers in Vietnam now have draftees amongst them, many of whom are voicing their distrust of the war, causing unrest in the ranks.
For my entire tour of duty, and I think by and large all of my soldier colleagues felt, we were wasting our time. But we've been told to do it, and we were soldiers, and we were good soldiers, and so we did it.
It's a very, 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 very desperate terrain there. Once you started to move north, it became different. Of course, you had mountains, you had Pleiku, Central Highlands, but certainly in the south, you had vast areas of paddy fields that you had to go through.
You know, that's when you know a war is lost. And you're still there, you're sort of the left behinds. You have no enthusiasm or any verve because you know that the cause might have seemed appealing 5 years ago, but it's gone. So what are you doing in the jungle? Which is why so many Americans got hooked on drugs, because there was no mental way out. It just didn't make any sense.
As he takes
The secrets of atrocities in Vietnam and bombing in Cambodia break in the press. The US public is shocked and outrage takes hold. When Senate transcripts were made public, news of increased US involvement in Cambodia and Laos surfaces. This leads to more demonstrations across America.
When Richard Nixon announced that his troops were being committed to Cambodia, the anti-war movement was revived in America. Huge moratorium marches protesting against the war in Cambodia spread to all parts of America and to other places such as Australia. In some cases, the National Guard fired on protesters.
Tragedy strikes at Kent University, Ohio in May 1970. Several anti-war protesters hurl rocks at the National Guard, who open fire on the crowd, killing 4 students.
Gotta get down to it. Soldiers are cutting us down.
Now, the parents of America are shocked. These are nice middle-class kids who were shot down by their own people. Congress gets up in arms and essentially stops funding the war, to stop increasing the return of US troops from South Vietnam.
The Vietnam War suffers decreasing support in the US. President Nixon is forced into eliminating the use of the draft. With ongoing peace talks in Paris stalling, he introduces another peace plan. With a continuing legacy of de-escalation, there were fears this was leading to a wider conflict in Indochina. The new president of North Vietnam, Le Duc Tho, and Henry Kissinger begin secret talks in an attempt to resolve the situation.
The peace talks were not very successful, especially under Nixon. However, it was clear that the war could not be ended finally without an agreement. And during 1971, the US conceded it would not oppose a continuation of the North Vietnamese troop presence in the south.
In 1971, the New York Times publishes the Pentagon Papers. This shows an incredible legacy of deception concerning US policy in Vietnam. President Nixon appeals to the Supreme Court in an attempt to stop the publication of sensitive material. However, the court rules in favor of the New York Times and allows continued publication. Under pressure from the Democrats, Nixon changes his policy and orders the gradual reduction of 540,000 troops in Vietnam.
What you had was the South Vietnamese army essentially fighting, backed by American air power, and with some American advisors still there.
The next step was the 1972 North Vietnamese offensive, which led to a revival in some parts of South Vietnam of the NLF guerrilla war.
Vietnamese communists mobilized and used tanks in a conventional war style, which they hadn't used before. They drove across the demilitarized zone into South Vietnam from North Vietnam. They captured various towns in the Saigon region, in particular a place called An Loc.
And the United States bombing of North Vietnam indeed escalated through the year 1972 while the peace talks were going ahead.
We have adopted a plan which we have worked out in cooperation with the South Vietnamese for the complete withdrawal of all U.S. combat ground forces.
President Nixon addresses the American public about withdrawing all US troops and therefore all involvement with the war in Vietnam. Ongoing secret peace talks are revealed. However, Nixon cannot stop himself from making more onslaughts in Cambodia.
I still think we ought to take the guys off now. I think the let brown people got blown around the front of the stuff. Well, no, I'd rather see some nuclear bombs. You got that ready? And that, I think, would just create too much. The nuclear bomb, that probably. I just want you to think big, Henry, for Christ's sake.
He also wants to force the hand of the North Vietnamese to make concessions in these talks, so he orders the bombing of fuel storage areas near Hanoi and Haiphong. The administration makes it clear to the North Vietnamese that no area of Vietnam is off limits to bombing raids.
Nixon every so often stopped the bombing of the North to try and encourage them to say something, and when they didn't, he started bombing them even more, and he attacked Hanoi and Haiphong, and they even mined the harbour at Haiphong to prevent supplies getting in.
The famous incident of Kim Phuc, the little girl whose picture of her back burning with napalm, running naked down the street, that was about 45 minutes out of Saigon. You felt the war. You could hear the bombing. There were rockets coming into Saigon from time to time. You'd wake up in the middle of the night and it would be from a shuddering blast.
Napalming a village. I mean, to see a village suddenly destroyed in front of you by a simple napalm bomb is a pretty devastating thing to watch.
Well, a few weeks after I got into the country, into my unit, up on the side of a mountain, we got bushwhacked, and the ambush came from above. And by the time everything was sorted out, a Super Sabre, the F-100, came clambering up the valley and dropped its payload up above us, and it was napalm. Boom, boom, boom. And it was, red fire and black smoke, just like in the various war films you see. And it was far away, not to get singed by it, but you could certainly feel the atmosphere change.
Henry Kissinger and Le Duc Tho reach an agreement in principle on various key measures leading to a ceasefire in Vietnam. However, the South Vietnamese President Thieu refuses to agree, saying the war in the South is still ongoing.
President Nixon has a bit of a problem because he's coming up to face a new election, and he'd promised peace with order and hadn't delivered it. So there's great pressure on him and his national security advisors, Henry Kissinger, to get some peace agreement.
At this point, the communist government in Hanoi, probably seeing the possibility of an agreement before the election, dropped its demand that the Thieu government be replaced. And this meant that an agreement was possible, and this was announced in October of 1972.
Its people have suffered much, and they will remain there after we leave.
We believe that peace is at hand.
The Americans just wanted to be out of the war, and they were finding any way of doing it, and peace with honor, as they called it.
They want to get the American army out of South Vietnam And then the South Vietnamese government would fall, and the communists would take over. They knew it was going to happen. It was just, they didn't want it to happen the day after they left.
The deal that President Thieu wanted, when it was clear that the Americans were going to cut a deal with the North Vietnamese, which would bring the American prisoners back home as well, which was a huge issue in America, was that President Thieu would see that it was a very bad deal for South Vietnam because he wanted a deal whereby the North Vietnamese troops would withdraw. And that was a deal that the Americans couldn't make the North Vietnamese agree to. So they put pressure on President Thieu to sign up to this peace agreement, which he did very reluctantly.
We have ended the longest and most difficult war in our history in a way that maintained the trust of our allies and the respect of our adversaries.
President Thieu is finally forced into signing with promises of aid against any further aggression from the North. The ceasefire is signed on January 28, 1973.
Then the US troops withdrew. The North Vietnamese handed over the 500 or more prisoners of war who had been held in the North, mostly pilots shot down there, and the agreement went ahead between Hanoi and the United States.
For the Americans, the war was over. They got their prisoners home. They had lost 55,000 Americans. Out of that 55,000, half of them were 17 or 18-year-olds. It had been a traumatic experience for America, so they just wanted to get out.
When the war ended in 1973, 591 prisoners were returned. This was only about 12% of those requested by the US. What happened to the other 3,109 that were asked for? Henry Kissinger sent a secret letter to the North Vietnamese Prime Minister that the US was willing to pay $3.2 billion for the return of the remaining prisoners of war. The US Senate voted against it.
America, I felt, just wanted to forget in a way Vietnam existed. After the signing of the Paris Peace Agreement, fighting continued for the South Vietnamese in South Vietnam, and 1,000 Vietnamese were dying a week. So in a year's casualties were more than the Americans suffered in the entire war.
The last American combat soldiers leave South Vietnam, though the military advisors and Marines protecting US installations remain. The US draft program is closed. The Nobel Peace Prize is given to Kissinger and Le Duc Tho. However, the North Vietnamese president does not accept it, as peace has not arrived in Vietnam. The North is still attacking the South. In America, President Nixon faces his own crisis. In June 1972, a story in the Washington Post had reported that burglars had been arrested inside the office of the Democratic National Committee in the Watergate complex in Washington. The reporters, Woodward and Bernstein, would investigate the story until they found evidence that a $25,000 check from Nixon's re-election campaign had been given to one of the burglars.
I believe that most anyone who worked at the White House during the past 4 years can attest to the concern that prevailed regarding any and all leaks.
The full story of Nixon's aides became a huge political scandal. They had been running an election campaign employing spying and sabotage.
I think it is time in this country to quit making national heroes out of those who steal secrets and publish them in the newspapers.
However, more secrets are revealed, which will make Nixon's presidency untenable. In 1974, President Thieu announces resumption of war against the North Vietnamese, who have been encroaching on the South in violation of the peace treaty. Weakened by wave after wave of air attacks from America since 1969, neighboring Cambodia is vulnerable to its own rising threat, the Khmer Rouge.
Cambodia is a case completely apart. I mean, it's never been equalled in modern times because it was an attempt by a small coterie of Cambodian communist leaders to turn it into a utopian agrarian society and destroying all of its connections with the outside world.
Once the Americans pulled out, the communists took over in Laos, and then the Khmer Rouge, who were only a handful of communist guerrillas in there, managed to force out the compromised and weakened Cambodian government ending in, what, 2 million dead?
The fallout from the Watergate scandal ultimately forces Nixon to resign from the presidency before being impeached.
In leaving it, I do so with this prayer. May God's grace be with you in all the days ahead.
In August 1974, Gerald Ford Jr. becomes the 38th president. With American troops out of Vietnam, the press report events there less and less. The public has lost interest in the war.
The Vietnam War, and it didn't concern Americans, particularly after all the coverage it had gotten for 10 years, it wasn't that big a story. I was on the telex with a foreign editor in New York, and I said, I'm catching a flight into Saigon tomorrow. And he said, are you volunteering to go to Vietnam? I didn't quite understand what was going on. I said, I'm booked, I'm going in tomorrow. He said, you're volunteering to go. And I finally caught on. What he was doing was establishing on paper that I was volunteering to go to Vietnam, that I was not being assigned to go to Vietnam. So that whatever happened, hey, he volunteered, we didn't make him go. We didn't even ask him to go. We didn't even suggest that he should go. You know how dangerous it is? Do you really want to go? Are you volunteering? So it just went on like that. So I kept, and eventually I said, yeah, I'm volunteering, I'm going tomorrow.
In Vietnam, President Thieu makes a mistake and withdraws all his troops from the north, causing mass panic. It's not long before the Viet Cong communists lay siege to the province just north of Saigon. There is no response from America. The Viet Cong move in on Hue and take the city.
Just a few minutes ago, we had confirmation that the city of Hue had fallen to the communists. It looks very much as if the North Vietnamese up there allowed these troops and these people to leave the beaches without firing on them, giving them a chance to get away before entering the city.
The North Vietnamese gradually built up strength and decided that they would go for broke, that the Americans were not going to intervene. So they launched a lightning offensive and swept up the country, taking over provincial towns north of Saigon.
Early Monday morning, a Viet Cong sapper unit, probably no more than 20 or 30 men and women, attacked and set fire to an American USAID installation, closing the bridge and Highway 1.
The South Vietnamese army simply cannot hold the line against the North Vietnamese, who are professional and dedicated, well-trained soldiers. Congress is now trying to wash its hands of the whole thing and is cutting back budget for aid to the South Vietnamese, so they're being restricted with their armaments, they're getting nothing at all.
President Thieu made a huge strategic blunder in withdrawing the remnants of the South Vietnamese army from these threatened northern areas and to bring them around to Saigon to protect Saigon, which the result was that the rest of the country fell completely into the communist hands. And then it was just a matter of time, really.
President Thieu resigns reluctantly, stating that in the end, the South Vietnamese had been let down by the Americans. The North Vietnamese army seized the opportunity and close in on Saigon. America needed to get as many of its remaining people out from the embassy, sending in all available helicopters. The Vietnamese also sensed the communist advance was close and were desperate to flee. Panic engulfed Saigon.
I'll tell you one thing which was really interesting, which I don't think it's been reported that much. In the big parking lot of the embassy, there was a beautiful tree. And the ambassador, Graham Martin, refused to cut down the tree. The CIA was going to him and saying, cut down that tree because this is where the helicopters are going to land, will have to land. And Martin refused.
The docks on Tuesday morning were crammed with thousands of Vietnamese desperate to escape from Saigon by any means possible.
I remember filming in Saigon where mothers were throwing their babies to strangers on the ship, literally throwing them like a parcel. save my babies, throwing their babies on board. You saw soldiers stripping off their uniforms and fighting almost naked to get on boats.
Many people died because their flimsy craft had sunk. They were often overloaded. They were attacked by pirates who raped and killed. It was a general disaster.
The Americans actually sent some aircraft in to airlift their own Vietnamese employees out of their embassies. Now, we had been told by the CIA, we expect to evacuate within the next 24 hours, 36 hours. What we don't want is for you guys to panic. So we've arranged there will be a signal broadcast by AFN, American Forces Network. They said it'll be Bing Crosby singing White Christmas. You imagine, it's 115 degrees outside.
Could you think of anything so incredible that Bing Crosby singing I'm Dreaming of a White Christmas would be the signal that the evacuation had begun? And when they told us in advance, a couple of days in advance, that this would be it, we thought they were joking.
By that time, the embassy is surrounded by thousands of Vietnamese, all trying to get into the compound. And we really had to fight and claw our way through this crowd to get to the wall.
People, lorries and cars, all chasing one American evacuation convoy after the other. Jams that the Vietnamese police tried to clear with their rifles, but people were no longer afraid of them. There was now so much more to be afraid of.
When we finally got to the wall, Marines had to really reach down and pull us up. And then, we see we're being pulled up, but all the people around us, including lovely kids, were not being pulled up.
But then suddenly we too, the 40 or 50 of us in the safety of the coaches, had to get out and fight our way to the American compound where the helicopters were landing to fly us and the thousands more out of the country.
And you had pictures, movie pictures, of the Americans on the plane actually punching people off. And you had helicopters flying off with people hanging on the skids and then dropping off. They were so desperate to escape. We did fight, we did claw. I remember saying in my commentary that I wasn't proud of what I did that day. But we got to the wall and the Marines were pulling us up. They punching the Vietnamese and pulling us up over the top.
He hauled us up, kicking and punching Vietnamese who were clambering over our bodies. Ashamed and exhausted, we took our turn in the long crowd of refugees inside the embassy compound and waited for the helicopters to come down for us.
I've been doing this for 48 years, and I think that's number one on my list. The last day of Saigon. The Americans losing their first war, leaving from the American embassy to go to a ship in the South China Sea that was an admission of defeat. In the helicopter that took us out, it was open in the rear, and I was just lying down on my stomach, looking out the back of the helicopter, saying goodbye to Saigon. And for me, I think for all of us who were there, and not meaning any disrespect, it'll never be Ho Chi Minh City in Saigon.
20 years since America first began financing the South Vietnamese, it was finally out of Vietnam. In the desperation to get as many people to safety, the carriers at sea struggled to cope with the mass of fleeing people.
The carriers were so full of helicopters, they were having to push helicopters that were very expensive over the side so others could land. In the general chaos of the situation, the Americans did not burn the files, secret files in their embassy. So when the North Vietnamese army turned up, the communists knew exactly who had been working for the Americans, and of course these people, if they weren't killed, were sent to re-education camps.
A former general called Big Min became president, and the communists knew that there was nothing stopping them. They were militarily superior. The Americans weren't going to intervene to stop them taking Saigon, and they just rolled on relentlessly.
When a tank turns up at the government house in Saigon, it's all over. The new interim president is told, you can't surrender what you don't have. He didn't have any power, he didn't have any troops, so it's just all over.
The communist side wins. It's a victory for the North Vietnam, the Democratic Republic, along with its fighters in the south. And for a year or so, you have the two countries continue to exist side by side. In 1976, the countries emerged into form the Socialist Republic, one country. The culmination, really, of what Ho Chi Minh and the other nationalists had been calling for, fighting for, ever since 1945.
The new Socialist Republic of Vietnam is declared with its new capital in Hanoi, and Saigon is renamed Ho Chi Minh City.
A very harsh period then happened in South Vietnam. Soldiers ended up in re-education camps all over the country and taken up to North Vietnam and put into camps. Many of them died.
They tried to impose hardline, socialist, Stalinist economic methods on the South, and the result is almost starvation.
When the Khmer Rouge attacked our provinces in the West, my heart is with my country. And I wrote article. They found that in that article there was some kind of fire in there, some kind of love in there. And they took me, the communists took me their side. And they asked me to spy on my colleagues, and I cannot do that. And I started to think of running away.
In America, Jimmy Carter is elected president and issues a pardon to all the draft dodgers. In 1978, the Socialist Republic of Vietnam invades Cambodia and defeats the Khmer Rouge, forcing them back into their jungle refuges on the Laos border.
The outside world, whether it be the United States and Europe, is fearful of what Vietnam intends to do in Southeast Asia. And so they actually condemn and impose sanctions on the Vietnamese for getting rid of the Khmer Rouge.
China decides to invade Vietnam and takes border cities, giving the warning, the gate to Hanoi is open.
The Vietnamese put up a very stirring defense and gave the Chinese a bit of a bloody nose.
And so Vietnam is almost completely isolated internationally. Its only friends, really, the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc from 1979, right the way through the 1980s. This is a very, very tough time in Vietnam.
The ravages of war have destroyed the agricultural base of these societies. Entire villages have been decimated, people forced to abandon their lands. From being net exporters of rice, many regions of Southeast Asia have become net importers. The pride of self-sufficiency is gone. What is left for millions of people is dependency on aid from the outside and the long search for a new life.
Many were desperate to escape the communist government and the terrible conditions they were forced to endure. Many Vietnamese tried to flee en masse in heavily overcrowded boats.
I pretend to be a Chinese. I pay the gold to Chinese boat master. So we three, myself, my wife, and my baby, we went down to the Mekong River Delta. Our wooden boat is about 25 meters long. It got 650 something people. So even when it was still not moving yet, people in the boat started to suffer already because we did not have enough air to breathe. We were in the sea for just 2 days when the engine got into trouble. Every light gone out, and in the dark you can hear everyone pray. I put my wife and my daughter in the very dangerous situation, but it's too late. And I cursed myself. The British commercial ship passed by. The wife of the captain asked to return to pick us because she saw people from our ship. We were lucky. And then the ship took all of us to Hong Kong. All of us were put into the prison. We were there for 4 weeks. At the end, we signed a paper with the IOCM to borrow from them the money to get tickets, one-way tickets from Hong Kong to England.
For those Vietnamese who didn't get out of Vietnam, the extremely difficult times continued. The report on the devastating effects of Agent Orange is revealed both in Vietnam and to the US veterans involved in the deployment of the toxic mix.
Old man lying by the side of the road, the lorries rolling by, blue moon sinking from the weight of the load, and the buildings scrape the sky.
Some of the most beautiful countryside in the world was just a desert. There were bomb craters where there should have been fields. Agent Orange was causing all sorts of birth defects in children.
I don't think that when the Americans were defoliating areas of Vietnam, they were intending to leave a long-lasting injuries in terms of future generations were going to be malformed as a result of these dioxins, these chemicals which are being dropped on them. That really wasn't the intention. But that in certain parts of Vietnam is what has happened.
Paul Reuterschen had been in contact with Agent Orange in the Vietnam War, shortly before his death from abdominal cancer in December 1978. He founded Agent Orange Victims International, which fought for compensation for US soldiers, filing multiple lawsuits against the 6 chemical companies in the US that produced Agent Orange, most significantly Dow and Monsanto. The class action case was settled in 1984 for $180 million. Of the 105,000 claims, approximately 52,000 Vietnam veterans or their survivors received cash payments, which average only $3,800 each. In 1982, as a tribute to the thousands of US soldiers who died in Vietnam, a Veterans Memorial opened in Washington. However, the Vietnam veterans who survived have never been given the support they deserve. After the takeover of the communists, Vietnam was left with a legacy of extreme war damage, unexploded bombs, and an impoverished economy. America dropped 7.8 million tons of bombs on Vietnam, more than it unleashed on Germany and Japan combined.
We were back there for one of their Independence Days. They had this communist parade down the main street of Saigon up to the presidential palace. Jap and the others were there, the old soldiers, the old liberators. And when you were on a tight shot, you were on them. When you widened up behind them on the roofs of buildings were advertisements for Sony and Sanyo and Toyota. So, communism? Who won the war?
There always were coffee plantations in South Vietnam, in the Central Highlands. The French had them, but the Vietnamese did clear a lot of land and build up these coffee plantations. Vietnam has become the world's second largest coffee producer.
It took most of the 1980s for the Vietnamese to extricate themselves from Cambodia, renegotiating their relations with the outside world.
By gradually allowing more and more freedom at the local economic level, the country was able to feed itself again and get to the position where Vietnam is the second largest rice exporter in the world.
In recent years, Vietnam has become one of the fastest growing global economies. It is a significant agricultural exporter, the third largest oil producer in Asia, and an important manufacturer of textiles, clothing, and computer and mobile phone components. Estimates of its population exceed 92 million.
Even now, Vietnam remains a communist country, despite all the trappings of motorbikes and advertising and all that sort of thing that you see. The Communist Party is still in charge of the organisation of the economy, and it still sees a big role for the state, and it has big agricultural enterprises.
Vietnam has become actually quite successful, but there is still a lot of press censorship, quite a lot of repression if you get out of line. But it's also the economy of South Vietnam has been helped by a return of South Vietnamese boat people who've gone to America, for example.
So many of the Vietnamese who've come to the States have done so well. And it was predictable. And these weren't the rich Vietnamese who managed to get out 6 months before the end of the war. These were boat people who are now doing so well in this country and have been doing so well in this country for a couple of decades now.
And they've gone back home to South Vietnam and set up businesses there. So the country is quite dependent on an enormous amount of money that comes in from the Vietnamese diaspora.
The Vietnam we knew during the war had a lot more reality to it.
Saigon itself has changed enormously. A lot of the old French buildings have been torn down, and buildings are high-rises with marble and glass, and Louis Vuitton shops and Prada shops. If I asked myself, I said, you know, is this really what these Vietnamese communists were fighting for?
There's no question that as soon as the war was over, they began building an economy. And look at Vietnam today.
Knowing that you lied, straight-faced while I cried, still I'd look to find a reason to believe.